I'd like to introduce our distinguished speaker for today. Professor Mehrzad Boroujerdi is Professor of Political Science and O. Henley Faculty Scholar at Syracuse University, but currently he's a Fellow of the American Council on Education in residence at California State University, Northridge. We are very happy to have him here this year. He is also a visiting scholar at UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies. Dr. Boroujerdi's research centers on intellectual and political history of modern Iran. He's the author of Iranian Intellectuals and the West, The Tormented Triumph of Nativism. Another book he wrote in Persian, this one, I Carved, Worshipped, and Shattered, Essays on Iranian Politics and Identity. And Post-Revolutionary Iran, a handbook, which is forthcoming from Syracuse University Press. And if you want to know about Iran, especially post-revolutionary Iran, anything you want to know is going to be in that handbook. He's the author of numerous journal articles and book chapters in English and Persian, and edited Mirror for the Muslim Prince, Islam and Theory of Statecraft. He has been a postdoctoral fellow and a Rockefeller Foundation fellow at Harvard University and University of Texas at Austin. In addition, he has served as the editor of the Modern Intellectual and Political History of the Middle East book series, the book review editor of the International Journal of Middle Eastern Studies during 2002-2007, and the principal investigator of the Iran Data Portal, a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., and president of the International Society for Iranian Studies during 2012-2014. I'm so happy he is here on our campus, and I have myself learned a lot from his writings, and I'm proud that he's a good friend and he accepted our invitation. I want also, before he starts talking, to thank Department of Political Science. They have, especially Dr. David Leitch, who they have co-sponsored this event, and also Professor Jane Bays, Director of Institute of Globalization, Gender, and Democracy, as co-sponsor of this event. And I also want to thank Kathy Draper and Raina Kennedy for their help with this event. Okay, Professor Boroujerdi, where you are.
Thank you, Dr. Toidi. Can everyone hear me? Okay, wonderful. Thank you for those kind words. I'm delighted to be able to talk to you on the subject of U.S. and imploding situation in the Middle East. My talk is going to be in three parts. In the first part, I briefly lay out some of the major trends that I see, or major observations about what's going on in this troubled region. In the second part, I try to address the situation very briefly in some of the key countries so that you have a sense of some of these problems that I'm referring to. And finally, in the last part, I want to deal with US policy, or lack thereof, in regard to this region of the world. I often like to start by saying Middle East is no Las Vegas, meaning what happens there doesn't stay there, right? Whether we like it or not, events that transpire in this region have a bad tendency to impact the rest of the world. For example, any political crisis can lead to an increase in the price of oil, and therefore you folks are impacted when you go to the gas station. That's one way. Another has to do with the frequency of military conflicts in this region. some of you might think that the US has withdrawn its forces from Iraq and therefore, we do not have too many soldiers or civilians serving in that region. If that's the case, let me correct that vision and say, as we speak, there are at least 54,000 American servicemen and Department of Defense civilians who are serving in various capacities in the Middle East. Another way you see the impact of the Las Vegas effect is all those refugees that have been fleeing the horrible conditions in places like Syria, heading for safer zones in Europe and elsewhere. These days, as somebody who has been studying this region, the situation is really quite depressing. And sorry if much of my presentation is going to have this depressing tone to it. But as a student of this region who has been dealing with this Middle East, North Africa, for 40 years or so, I have never seen this region in a worse shape than it is today. All right? Never. And that's, counting all the Arab-Israeli wars and everything else that has happened in that region. So, a nickname that some have come up for the Middle East is to refer to it as the Muddle East, right? It's the zone of conflict and war. Let me put things in perspective. Let's go back to 2003, before the US invasion of Iraq. At that time, if you were looking at this region, there were a couple of countries that would stand out in terms of the degree of political violence. Okay? Places like Iraq, Palestine, West Bank, Israel, whatever you want to call it. But today, that list has grown. In addition to those two countries, you have Bahrain, Egypt, Libya, Syria, Yemen. Some of these countries I will be talking about in a moment here. So as a political scientist, when I look at this region, here is where the crisis really comes into play. In the greater Middle East and North Africa, we encounter 10 fragile states. What do I mean by fragile states? Meaning states that cannot enforce law and order within their borders, right? States that are incapable of providing basic services that a citizenry needs. States where the citizenry basically votes with its feet and decides to leave. What are those 10 fragile countries? Start with Afghanistan. So this is the arc of crisis, right? From Afghanistan all the way to Libya and Mali on the west side. So Afghanistan, Iraq, Lebanon, Libya, Mali, Somalia, South Sudan, Sudan, Syria, Yemen. Now ask yourself the following question. What is the cumulative impact of having 10 fragile states when the central government is really not in charge? Well, to put things in perspective, let's remember something. Afghanistan, that gave us 9/11, was only one fragile state. Now multiply it by 10 to think about the potential of unrest that one encounters in this region right now. Third point I want to make is about the calamity of the Arab world. What do I mean? There is a report, annual report, that is published called Arab Human Development Report. The numbers I'm going to give you right now are taken from the 2016 version of this Arab Human Development Report. And please pay close attention to some of these numbers, because I think the numbers speak volumes. All right, it says, the Arab world has 5% of the world population, 400 million people, and yet it accounts for 45% of world terror attacks, 57% of all refugees in the world, 68% of battle-related deaths, 17% of conflicts, and 47% of internally displaced people. These are people who do not become refugees, meaning leave their country to go next door. These are people who are forced, due to conditions of war, to move from one part of their own country to safer areas, right? So we call them internally displaced people. Half of those people around the world are from this region. Now, the Middle East also happens to be the most over-militarized region around the globe. How so, you might ask? Consider the following. In terms of highest defense spending as a share of GDP, gross domestic product, the top 5 countries in the world who has spent the most in this sense, meaning as percentage of GDP, not in terms of actual dollar amount, right? Because that's, of course, the United States, China, and the like. But in terms of GDP, are countries such as Oman, with the highest, 16.8, and you scratch your head and say, who are the Omanis going to fight, right? Devoting 16.8% of their GDP to military armaments. Followed by Saudi Arabia, Syria, Algeria, and Kuwait, right? All from the region. Now, of the top 10 countries that are hit by terrorism, despite all this military spending that I mentioned, 5 are also in the Middle East. Iraq, Syria, Turkey, Yemen, Libya come to mind. In addition to these wars and casualty figures, here is what the Arab Human Development Report continues to say about the general public. 78% of Arabs live in hardship or in the category of in need, right? They are poor, in other words. 2/3 of the roughly 400 million people in the Arab world are below the age of 30. That translates to 260 million young people, right? And about 100 million of them are in the age bracket 15 to 29. So imagine what that means. Well, you talk to economists, and an economist would say, having a young population is good, because that's human capital, surely. But having a young population also has a negative side to it, meaning those guys need jobs. They need the schools, right? They want to get married, there has to be housing, on and on and on. And here is where you run into problem. How come? Well, consider this one. 20% unemployment rate in the Arab world represents the highest unemployment rate around the globe. Women account for 22% of, only 22% of Arab females are active in the labor force, which again happens to be the lowest percentage in the world. Okay? And then we come to the quality of education. Again, this is not me, this is the Arab Human Development Report talking. They report half of mid-primary and mid-secondary school Arab students do not meet basic learning levels, be it in rich or in poor countries. Right? In other words, they are ill-prepared in terms of the education that they receive for the challenges of 21st century. So, do I have your attention now in terms of this laundry list, right, of problems that this region is facing? Okay. Now, let's consider the following. So far, I have portrayed for you this picture of some endemic, deep-rooted socio-economic problems that these countries have had. Now imagine on top of this layer of crises, right, you have the political mess that we have right now. And then again, ask yourself the question of how are people going to survive? What's going to be the future here? I mentioned 2003, US invasion of Iraq. Right? Again, remember, this is 2 years after 9/11. And closer? Sure. This is 2 years after 9/11 and the invasion of Afghanistan, the fight with Al-Qaeda, and so forth. All right, what happened as a result of that? What happened was that by toppling Saddam Hussein in Iraq, a political vacuum was created in this region. And we political scientists like to say, politics does not like a vacuum. Every time there is a vacuum in a political situation, entrepreneurial actors step in and try to fill that vacuum. And in this case, of course, in addition to US and others, there were plenty of regional actors who wanted to have a bigger share of the pie. In particular, two of them, Iran and Saudi Arabia, okay, who have had their long simmering disagreements on account of, call it Shiite versus Sunni, call it, regional hegemony. The fact is that these two big powers have been rival and have been trying to undermine each other for a long time. And as the saying goes, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that gets hurt, right? And right now in the Middle East, a lot of countries, i.e. Yemen, Lebanon, are equivalent to that grass, where that type of fight is having its impact being felt. As a result, we are seeing some phenomenal, interesting stuff happening in this region. Much of the old truisms no longer hold. For example, we have the saying, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Well, not in the Middle East. Not in the Middle East. Case in point, in Iraq, the Shiite forces were fighting ISIS, the Islamic State grouping, right? And yet, that didn't necessarily endear them to the United States because of the problems that the US has with the Shiite forces in Iraq. Or think about Saudi Arabia, perhaps the most conservative Arab state, getting closer to a state like Russia. Or think of the Saudis and the Israelis having all sorts of, under the table meetings and agreements going on. And so forth and so on. The list can continue. So a lot of states are feeling the impact of the war between these two elephants. One other observation I want to make is that, yes, these are fragile states, the ones that I mentioned, the 10 that I mentioned, right? But at the end, recent events indicate that states win at the end of the game. Again, case in point, Iraq and Syria. Two countries where the central power, central authority, was challenged to an unprecedented extent. And yet, in both instances, the central power has managed to, seems like it, at least as of this point, to have come out victorious, right? Because the state has too many aces in its hand that it can play with. Okay, let me, because I want to try to leave as much time for Q&A, let me quickly go through what are some of these crises in these countries that I'm talking about. Let's just start with Iraq. Okay, Iraq really turned out to be a laboratory for how not to do things, right? Remember, the US promise was that the Bush administration view was that we are going to go there, the Iraqis are going to be embracing us with open hands because they are so sick and tired of Saddam Hussein, right? We are going to show them a shock and awe campaign. and it's going to be a cakewalk. Well, guess what? That was 2003. 2017, that crisis still goes on. We saw the rise of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and after that, ISIS. And God knows what's going to come next. This chapter has not been written yet, right? Yes, ISIS has suffered enormous setbacks, both in Iraq and in Syria, but I'm not convinced that this is quite the end of this organization, that it cannot transform itself into a guerrilla force, move to territories such as Afghanistan or Libya, Egyptian Sinai, and the like, to continue causing mischief for years and years to come. We also had another problem in Iraq with the Kurds. For those of you who are not familiar, the Kurds constitute the largest ethnic group in the Middle East. Some 30 million people who have been aspiring to have their own state for the longest time, right? One of the longest struggles of the 20th century. Well, in Iraq, the Kurds gambled to have a referendum on their independence. Overwhelmingly, the vote was positive. Over 94% said yes. But the Iraqi government said, not on my watch. And they managed to push back the Kurds. And, by now, we have all forgotten about that referendum. In other words, the Kurds gambled, and they lost very badly in Iraq. Next door to Iraq is Iran, one of those regional powers, right? As you may know, Iran and Iraq fought a nasty war for 8 years. And the Iranians are thinking to themselves, we are not going to let Iraq to threaten us ever again. So keeping Iraq weak serves Iran's interests quite well, because you do not want to challenge once again. And it was a nasty fight, use of chemical weapons, firing missiles at each other's urban centers, and the like. So that logic is also quite understandable in terms of what's going on. Iraq is a devastated country even after kicking ISIS out. So now the coffers of the central state are empty, okay? The government does not really have the revenue to pay all those folks on its payroll, or to undertake the massive task of reconstruction. Conservative estimates for reconstruction in Iraq is $100 billion. Now, guess what? Iraq is also a single product economy, meaning it all depends on oil, right? With the depressed prices of oil in the world markets, the Iraqis do not have the resources. Again, to put things in perspective, as we speak right now, oil is $60 per barrel. 3 years ago, this same barrel of oil was $90 per barrel. It fluctuates depending on the laws of supply and demand, right? So the Iraqis do not have the resources. And I will come back to this issue later on. Syria. Again, please absorb the numbers for a moment. 6 years of civil war, 500,000 killed, 5 million refugees, 6 million internally displaced. Okay? One of the worst humanitarian disasters of our time in Syria. And again, same situation as in Iraq. Where is the money for reconstruction going to come? And if there is no money, how is that going to translate to political dissent? Okay? And everything that sets in motion as a result. Furthermore, what's going to happen to all those foreign fighters who were attracted to the conflict in Syria and now need to have a second career someplace else? Okay? So Syria is there. You would think that with Syria and the numbers I gave you, that should win the medal for the disaster in the region. But that unfortunate honor perhaps should go to another country called Yemen, the poorest country in the Arab world. Yemen. Okay? Again, a civil war erupted in 2014, where a rebel group decided to challenge the authority of the central government. They pushed the guy who was in charge out. Next year, by 2015, Saudi Arabia decided that it's going to restore the old government into place. And the Saudis sent troops to Yemen, and they have been engulfed in that conflict ever since. Yemen, for those of you, again, who don't know much about the geography of this region, is perhaps one of the worst countries on the face of the planet for anyone to be able to win militarily. Egypt, which was had the largest army in the Arab world of the 1960s, tried under President Gamal Abdel Nasser. It failed, okay? And the Saudis are not going to get anywhere in Yemen as well. But as a way of punishing the rebels, the Saudis have decided to impose a draconian embargo. Cholera is a disease that many of you now read about in your medical textbooks or in public health discussion, right? It has been wiped out. But in Yemen, it has come back with a fury. Today, the UN estimates that almost 1 million people are at the risk of, cholera, because, of course, there is no clean water. The garbage doesn't get collected, and the like. On top of that is a problem of hunger. Some of you might have seen the 60 Minutes segment this past Sunday on the crisis in Yemen. Right now, again, according to UN, these are UN numbers, 17 million people in Yemen are on the brink of famine. Notice, not because of a natural disaster, but because of a man-made conflict, right? 17 million people. So that's the magnitude of the problem we are talking about here. And of course, that has created its own set of challenges. Now, that's only the tip of the iceberg. There are other problems. Even among wealthy countries. Some of you might have heard of the tiny island state of Qatar, the country that has the highest GDP per capita. In other words, it's the wealthiest country in the world, right? Let me put it this way. Average per capita income in the United States is $50,000. In Qatar, it's over 100,000. So if you want to make it rich, you need to move to Qatar, okay? But here in Qatar, we are observing a wonderfully complicated conflict between a series of countries that are US allies. On the other side, fighting Qatar, is a coalition made up of Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, and the like. In other words, these 6 small countries, well, with the exception of Saudi Arabia, shouldn't be called the small, but the other ones are really tiny states. They all came together in the early 1980s to create a defense security pact called the Gulf Cooperation Council to encounter the power of the 2 biggest states next to them, Iran and Iraq. But now, thanks to this conflict, Gulf Cooperation Council, or GCC, as the abbreviation goes, is a thing of the past, okay? And 6 months into this crisis, there is no prospect of when this thing is going to end, because the Qataris have really deep financial pockets and have been able to come up with a counter strategy to what Saudi and the United Arab Emirates are trying to do. So that's another problem. Why is it of interest to the United States? Well, because the biggest US military installations are located in these countries. The US base in Qatar is truly a humongous city. And it's from that base that much of the operations against Al-Qaeda and so forth in the Arabian Peninsula, in Afghanistan, etc., was staged, right? So these places are important. Okay, and then there is wonderful Lebanon, a country that, in my view, constantly flirts with civil war. It had a civil war from 1975 to 1990, a civil war that basically attracted the interest of every regional actor who wanted to say something about the future of Lebanon. And once again, we might be on the brink of another political military mess in Lebanon. Again, a very brief set of historical facts to put things in perspective. Lebanon sits next to Israel. The Palestinians set up their operations in Lebanon in the 60s and 70s. From there, they staged, attacks on the Israelis. The Israelis invaded, and so many Palestinian refugees to this day live in Lebanon. Now, thanks to the Syrian conflict, hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees have also come to Lebanon, in a country with perhaps the most complicated confessional system. Lebanon has three major religious groups: Christians, Sunnis, and Shiites. It has 18 officially recognized denominations, but it has these three major religions, right? Religious groupings. Now, in Lebanon, the country has not taken a census since the 1930s, right? Any one of you who studies public administration, sociology, might ask, what the hell is going on? Why would the country not take a census? After all, don't you need to know how many citizens you have, how many hospital beds, schools, etc. you need? Surely you do, okay? Any type of social engineering, any type of a statecraft has to be based on data. But in Lebanon, we cannot have a census. Why? Because the political formula that was put into place back in 1930, which created the power-sharing mechanism, was based on this. The Christians were considered to be the majority, so the president of the country should always be a Christian. The Sunnis were considered to be the second largest, so the prime minister should be a Sunni, and the Shiites were the third, so they should be, the speaker of the parliament should be a Shiite. But for the time being, right, from 1930s up to now, a lot of things have changed demographically. A lot of Christians have left the country, emigrated out. They have lower birth rates, and therefore the Sunni and the Shiite populations, particularly the Shiite one, has increased a lot. So if you take a census, now you need to change that political formula from the 1930s. And who wants to own up to that crisis and the war that it invariably will set in motion? So, let's just sweep the problem under the rug. Who needs the data on census? Okay, let the old system be in place and pretend everything is nice and dandy as before. But meanwhile, in the Shiite community, the Hezbollah force has grown, and it has become the largest, most effective fighting force that the Arab world frankly has against the Israelis. So Hezbollah has become a state within a state in the tiny country of Lebanon, okay? And now the prime minister of that country, prime minister of Lebanon, in an unheard of act, went to Saudi Arabia and announced his resignation from the Saudi capital. And he is supposed to go back to Lebanon, I guess, tomorrow or today, so that the president can have a face-to-face talk with this gentleman and see, is this decision for real? Did he make it, or did the Saudis make it for him? And what's going to happen to Lebanon after this resignation is accepted? Okay, there are other problems. In Saudi Arabia, we have a 32-year-old crown prince who seems to be, in my view, arrogant enough to think that he's going to reshape the Middle East in his image. And he's, of course, is moving a lot of the chairs on the deck. And the impact of that thing is being felt both domestically within Saudi Arabia, but also in the region as Saudis adopt a more muscular foreign policy, okay, to confront Iran, Hezbollah, and the like. In Egypt, we had a military coup a few years back where a CSUN graduate who happened to be the president of the country, a gentleman by the name of Morsi, is now sitting in jail in Cairo. The military overthrew him, okay? But the rest of the world basically decided to conveniently look the other way because we were not ready to deal with the consequences of calling a coup and what it means. So Egypt has its own set of problems. Turkey, another powerful state in this region, a NATO ally, has had its share of disagreements with the United States over a whole host of issues. The US supported the Kurds in Syria, and in Iraq, the Turks are dead opposed to any right for the Kurds because they are worried about their own Kurdish population asking for more rights there. Okay? There are other issues, on Syria and the like. So that has been a deterioration there. And finally, there is the issue of Iran. President Obama, his most important foreign policy accomplishment was a nuclear deal with Iran that was in the works for 12, 13 years, the last 2 years of which was really intensive negotiations. And now President Trump has said that he's not willing to basically endorse that nuclear deal, which is going to really create a fascinating problem in the following sense. If this deal was negotiated between Iran and 5 or 6 Western powers, what happens when the US abandons a multilateral deal? Will the Iranians have, therefore, a blank check to, once again, speed up their nuclear program? And what would be the ramifications of that for the region in terms of giving, rise to a nuclear arms race in the region? I will be happy to entertain, questions about any of these countries during Q&A, but let me move on to the last part on US role and the region. So what have we learned? Since 2001, when the US went after Afghanistan, okay, what have we learned? After all, 16 years should be a sufficient time span for us to be able to pass some preliminary judgment, okay, on lessons learned. Okay, what the last 16 years has taught me are the following. There are serious limitations for the United States in terms of what it can do and cannot do. Don't be fooled by the tough rhetoric coming out of Washington. The fact of the matter is that we have seen in practice that the US has not been able to address the root causes of terrorism or internal insurgencies in this region of the world. They are too complex. They require too much resources. They require too much patience and strategic thinking than our politicians have managed to show so far to us that they possess. Second, US receives a grade of F when it comes to nation building. To put it in your language, we suck at it, right? We suck at it. Again, the fabric, the political, cultural, social, economic fabric of these countries, the geopolitical positions that they occupy are so complex that these cookie-cutter solutions that Washington tends to be fond of, okay? We go and do X, we impose law and order, you know, we support the good guys versus the bad guys, and everything will be wonderfully dandy. That has failed. We have now been in the longest conflict in US history, in Afghanistan, and guess where the Taliban are? Rather than being defeated, we are begging them, in so many words, to sit down and negotiate with us for a solution to the crisis in Afghanistan, right? In Iraq, the shock and awe campaign basically translated to US leaving and saying, you know, enough of this mess, you guys deal with it. And of course, by leaving, you have rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. Case in point, the Kurds, who considered themselves America's most loyal allies, right? They feel that they have been abandoned. At any moment, Washington felt they were no longer needed. So, I want to move on to conclude with the Trump administration. But some of these reservations and complaints that I have about US foreign policy, of course, predate the Trump administration. With President Trump, the situation has become even worse, meaning we have become accustomed to unpredictable, instinctual, and undisciplined foreign policy making on the part of the administration in Washington. The Trump administration, you know, has been in power less than a year, but it has reversed itself on so many occasions. For example, at first, he argued that it is not a prerequisite that President Assad of Syria has to leave. And then he changed his position and said, no, Assad and his family have no role in the future of Syria. And now that Assad seems to have the upper hand in the conflict, we should expect yet another change in position from the Trump administration, right? Because the guy has won the military battle. He's nowhere, you know, to be leaving the scene in that regard. When the conflict between Qatar, Saudi Arabia erupted, President Trump instinctively supported the case of Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. But then when his advisors told him, Mr. President, we have this huge base in Qatar. We need the Qataris. He then modified his position and said, well, both sides try to work out your disagreements. Okay? And of course, I mentioned, you know, this flip-flop on the Iranian nuclear deal, which again, as you can imagine, is so significant in that sense. Now, in addition to these flip-flops, change of positions, etc., President Trump has also done a number of things that has angered many people in this region. The Muslim travel ban was something that was universally denounced in this region, in the Middle East. Promising during the campaign season that he is going to move the US Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem right, was another claim, argument that again rubbed the people the wrong way. And if he were to carry out this promise, then you can rest assured, right, that we will have yet another episode of the Arab-Israeli dispute erupting here. Siding with the 32-year-old Saudi prince that I mentioned is another reckless action, in my view, in terms of what the Trump administration is doing. And guess what? He has assigned the task of dealing with the super complicated Arab-Israeli dispute, right? An issue that has not been solved since 1948. So complex in its texture. To whom? To his 36-year-old son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who has no background whatsoever in diplomacy or conflict resolution. The Arab media has started referring to him as the junior moron, right? Junior moron is now supposed to be solving the Arab-Israeli dispute for us. Okay, and of course, the slogan of America First has not endeared Trump to the people in the region as well, right? Because basically what this translates it to is, it's not human rights or any of those lofty goals that matters to us. It's our pure economic interest. So if there are refugees from Syria, if there are those young kids in Yemen being inflicted with cholera and so forth, not my business, not my concern, okay? We had a hand in the creation of the crisis in Iraq, but we are not going to be a party to its reconstruction. And whatever money is needed there as well, and so forth and so on. So, as I said, I wanted to leave time for question and answer. I hope the message that I'm delivering to you, even though it's pessimistic, it happens to have a strain of realism to it, right? I personally subscribe to the philosophy of pessimism of intellect, optimism of will. You can be pessimistic intellectually, right? But you should not be abandoning that desire, that optimism, that will to try to change things. And I guess my departing comment is that keep remembering, if this is no Las Vegas, the picture I depicted for you, the problems that that region has, is going to impact you one way or the other, right? So does it not make sense for us to educate ourselves and, if possible, to lend a hand to try to solve these problems rather than being uninterested observers? I will conclude with this. On the first day of my classes, I tell the students who enroll in my poli-sci classes the following, that you guys might not be interested in politics, but politics is interested in you like hell, right? Politics is not something that you can leave aside. It impacts you whether you like it or not. It impacts you in how much it taxes you, whether it sends you to a war. It instructs you how fast you can drive in the highways, and on and on and on, right? So instead of pretending that you are not interested in politics, please change the mindset and say, I better get to know this animal because it impacts me whether I like it or not. Thank you. Let me stop here.
Thank
Thank you very much. We have some time for question and answer.
Questions? Yes, sir.
Here's the statement, pessimism on the intellect, optimism on the will, but simultaneously you were very critical of Muhammad bin Salman, Saudi Arabia. This is a guy who has said that he is not only going to push to allow women to drive, he's going to open the Saudi economy and national investment too. He even is on the record as saying that he wants to bring, as you said, the most conservative nation, perhaps the most conservative nation in the Middle East, from fundamentalist Islam or Islamic interpretation. So would you say that is the deal that we should be optimistic?
Okay, very good question. So you're absolutely right. Oh yeah, the question is, I was critical of the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia, and the gentleman is asking, well, here is the guy who has allowed the Saudi woman to drive and wants to open up the Saudi economy. So does he not represent this optimism of will argument? More moderate Islam. Right. Okay. So here is my response to it. Absolutely. Saudi Arabia is a very closed society. I have been there. I have seen it, with my own eyes in terms of desperately needing to really, enter the 21st century in terms of rights of the citizenry. And the actions, of course, are long overdue, right, for allowing women to drive. Stopping some of the excesses of the religious police who roam the streets, right, and can arrest you and issue you fines for not dressing properly and the like. Those things have certainly brought him brownie points, right? Saudi Arabia has a very young population, so these type of actions are very popular with the Saudis, no question about it. And of course, they are the right things to do, no denying it. However, my concern is that he is utilizing this, right? This, political capital that he's gaining from this thing, at the same time that he's cleaning house and getting rid of his opponents. Now, the Saudi establishment likes to say everyone that he's getting rid of are the conservative clerics. But that's not true, because the people who he has been arrested are also some of the most outspoken liberals in the Saudi world. So basically what we are ending up with is a guy with a BA degree, 32 years old, no background whatsoever in terms of a statecraft, right? And the man is presently in charge of the Interior Ministry, Defense Ministry, oil company, okay? And I wouldn't be surprised if in a matter of days, if not weeks, his father is going to be pushed aside, and this 32-year-old is going to become the next Saudi king, okay? Listen, already we are seeing some of the impact of the rash decisions he has made. Yemen is a case in point, right? In Yemen, he has hired mercenaries from around the globe, including Central America, to go and fight the rebel group, the Houthis, in Yemen. So it is this mixed bag, right? It is this miscalculations. It is forcing the resignation of the Lebanese prime minister that worries me about what's going to happen in Saudi Arabia. But I guess, time will tell, right? Whether this becomes sort of a enlightened autocrat, or whether he will run into some serious problems. After all, keep in mind, please, that the Saudi establishment is made up of 7,000 princes and princesses, okay? For any one individual to become too powerful, you will be creating a good number of enemies along the way.
Okay, next question. Yes, here, why don't you use the mic?
Do I have to?
Just use it.
I don't. There's a saying that says that the U.S. is the world's policeman. Do you believe that the United States should be more or less involved in foreign affairs?
So In Persian, right, we have a saying that goes like this. If you have a bigger roof, you end up with more snow on the roof, right? Because of your size of the house. United States is a global superpower. Indeed, it's the only, standing superpower in the world. Therefore, U.S., the way it articulates its interests is that it has interests around the globe, right? United States has military bases in over 70% of the countries around the globe, right? That's 70 out of 200 countries in the world, okay? So imagine what happens when you play this role, okay? Again, you are going to be rubbing a lot of people the wrong way because they will see things as violation of their sovereignty, okay? They will see that the U.S. playing an outsized role in dictating the terms to the local politicians, okay? So those things are not going to buy U.S. brownie points. But as somebody who teaches international relations, right, I'm also realistic enough to know that you cannot wish the U.S. to pack up its bag and go. Ain't happening. Ain't happening, right? Therefore, it's not a question of what I like or dislike. I like to formulate the question as, that's the fact. And again, if you have a bigger roof, you end up with more snow. If you are a superpower and you meddle in the affairs of other countries, be willing to pay the price, right? That is it's the inevitable outcome of playing that bigger role.
And next question, yes, sir. There. Yes. Who's this?
Recently, the Prime Minister of Israel stated that there's a stronger connection between the Sunni states and Israel. And it's also well known that they've been supporting the Kurds in Erbil, Iraq, and Kurdistan. Don't you think that to some extent Israel is kind of taking advantage of the rift that exists between Shiites and Sunnis all around the region in order to exacerbate these conflicts and perhaps tip the power balance even more in their favor than it already is?
So again, another thing that I like to share with my students is the following argument. In international politics, we like to say, there is no such thing as a permanent friend or permanent enemy, right? Everything changes. You can abandon a traditional friend when the actions of that friend is going to be contradicting your interest, okay? And you should be willing to go to bed with the devil if the advantage is that you fight a bigger force, okay? So surely the Israelis have had their problems with the Arab world, but as I was explaining in many other instances, right, there now seems to be a convergence of interests. The Saudis and the Israelis both consider, for example, Iran as their major headache. So why shouldn't they collaborate, despite all the past bad blood, right, between the two sides? Yes, so, again, I don't blame Israel or any other country for trying to pursue their national interests. That's the nature of the beast. When you enter international politics, I think we need to recognize that international politics is not the arena for Mother Teresa, right? It's not. And the interests of no two states are the same. So what we end up is a convergence of interests on certain issues and disagreements on others, okay? Again, let me point out this issue that I referred to. US and Turkey are both members of NATO alliance. But the Turks are dead opposed to the US support for the Kurds, okay? So much so that the tension has now risen to the level that they, abandon this practice of not requiring visas for each other's citizens to visit there. So that's how I see it.
Okay, thanks. Next question.
building on what you just said about there's no permanent friend and no permanent enemy in politics. In Afghanistan, you know, that we would get into fights with Taliban, and then the next day we would go with the government in Karzai and have meetings with Taliban, and now it's kind of getting more prevalent that they have meetings with them. Do you feel like they're going to bring members of the Taliban or the leaders of the Taliban into the government? And if they do, what would that impact on the country be?
Yes, of course. You know, the Afghan government position, if you follow it, has all been based on the following reasoning. We want to talk to the Taliban because Taliban are a fact on the ground, right? The central government owns a certain percentage of the country. Come nighttime, right? Many of those territories that the government controls during the day go, you know, under Taliban control at night. Okay, it's an indigenous force. The Taliban is not, you know, a bunch of, you know, imported mercenaries, right? It's an indigenous force. These guys know the lay of the land. They have the willingness to fight. Okay, for their own logic, whatever the case might be, whether it's, you know, religious fanaticism, whether it's, you know, poppy cultivation interest, economic interest, you name it, right? But the Taliban is a fact on the ground. So guess what? Our government here in the US asked the government of Qatar to allow Taliban to open up an office in Doha, Qatar, so that negotiations could take place with Taliban representatives in Qatar, you know, away from the eyes of the media, right? And again, you know, I'm very pragmatic when it comes to international politics, right? If the US, with its enormous power, after 16 years, you have not been able to defeat the Taliban militarily, that should tell you something. There is not a military solution there, right? There is not a military solution. So sooner or later, you need to enter negotiations with the Taliban, despite everything we have said, you know, denouncing them and so forth. Otherwise, what's the alternative? Continue the present fight in perpetuity?
Any more questions? Comments? I have a question.
Sure.
Do you have any good news from the Middle East?
Any good news?
Any good development? Anything optimistic,
yes.
Hopeful?
No, absolutely, yes. So what I see that really gives me hope is that the young population in this region is truly impressive, okay? I mentioned being to Saudi Arabia. I went there 2 years ago for an educational fair, okay? During the 3 days that we were at this educational fair in Riyadh, over 200,000 young men and women walked through the door, right? And they would engage us sometimes in flawless English, okay? About educational opportunities that they wanted to pursue, okay? About what was going outside the world, what they saw as being wrong in their own country. I will never forget this. The lady representing an all-female university in Riyadh took me to the second floor, and she lifted her veil. And again, in flawless English, she was saying, look, here is the type of problems that the males have created for us, okay? But here are the ingenious ways that we are trying to, push back, right? Push the envelope. That was really uplifting to see them. Another example, on almost a daily basis now, I entertain questions, emails from a student from Iran, okay? Who have read either some of my works or are asking larger questions, okay? And they want advice and so forth. And it has become so frequent that I have, even created a template, okay, for my responses, put it on my Facebook page, because I can, have a FAQ document responding to their type of question. So what I see here is the following. These old generation of statecrats who really only believed in one-way dialogue, right? One-way conversation. They are encountering a citizenry that has become much more globally aware, much more assertive, and this thing is going to catch up with them. Okay, the quality of what you see in this younger population, I think, is truly impressive. At Syracuse, for 7 years, we had a program sponsored by the State Department where we would bring 20 young civil society activists from the Arab world to Syracuse every year, and put them through intensive workshops for 3 months. And it gave me a chance over 7 years to really get to know over 200 of these folks, from Yemen all the way to Morocco. And I went and visited them in many of their countries, and etc. And it is really, you really see a sea change in terms of approach of this younger, citizenry. Views on women, views on Sunni Shiite divide, on religious fanaticism, etc., has changed dramatically in the region. So I think that's the positive news that we should take to heart.
So going back to the first question asked by one of my best students, so don't you think that then the current prince in Saudi Arabia, Prince Salman, who is much younger, is representing some of these aspirations? While he's also I agree, very arrogant and already corrupt and all that, but don't you think he's also doing some overdue, timely reforms?
Course. Absolutely. I don't think anyone in their right mind, right, can object to giving the woman the right to drive, right? Absolutely. That's a right, logical decision that they have to make. But I'm saying, don't expect that, or don't equate that to democracy.
Of
right?
course.
We are seeing a one-man rule, being created, and that's not the same as democracy. Or going back to your questions about opening up the economy, the way to open up the economy is not to arrest, all these major, business folks. That's going to send shivers, right, through the economic world in terms of investment. Today it was reported that the son of the former king had to be taken to emergency room because apparently he was subjected to so much torture.
Wow.
They are forcing him to reveal, cough over 75% of all their holdings, right? So, how do you compare these? Giving the woman the right to vote, but also basically taking away, people's income and, giving us these nasty wars, etc. So it's a mixed bag.
Yes. Any more questions? We have time for one more question or comment. Okay.
Okay, so you seem very critical of the potential reversal of the Iran deal, but in light of the fact that the Iran deal has to be recertified on a semi-annual basis by Congress, and the fact that to date Iran possesses the capacity to enrich or process uranium, and they're also not allowing the international inspectors to fully investigate many of their military facilities and bases. What other move is there other than to renege on the Iran deal, given that Iran will not allow us to actually investigate them and see if they are in compliance?
Okay, so let's first get our facts right, okay? The reason I support the nuclear deal is due to the following facts, all right? Number one, the nuclear deal reduced Iran's first-generation centrifuges from 19,000 to 6,000. Advanced centrifuges went down from 6,000 to 0, okay? And low-enriched uranium stockpile went from 19,000 pounds to 660 pounds, right? These are numbers given out by the International Atomic Energy Commission. Iran's breakout time went from 1 or 2 months to over a year, right? So the first counter response I have is, show me any other arrangement that could have produced this type of dramatic results. Secondly, you see, we are now adding conditions that were not part of the nuclear deal, okay? Iran has a very weak air force. Well, you know why? Because Iranian Air Force before the revolution was all made up of American jets. After the hostage crisis, the revolution, etc., US decided we are no longer going to give you these fighter jets, right? So how did the Iranians compensate for having a weak air force? Was by enhancing their missile technology, right? And their argument again was, Iraqis fired missiles at our cities, at our civilian centers during the war. We need some way to fight back, okay? So now the critics of the nuclear deal are saying, but the deal doesn't say anything about Iran's missiles. It was not supposed to. It was a nuclear agreement. It was not an, all-encompassing, right, deal to address every area of difference. Because again, when we teach negotiations, one of the first things we say, whether it's between a husband and wife, or whether it's between different parties, is that you do not need to fight over every single item on the table. Break it down, right, to smaller chunks that you can swallow. See if you can create a goodwill. See if you can reach an agreement on issue area A before you move on to B and C, etc. Anyhow, so including those type of conditions now runs totally contrary to the letter of what the law is. Secondly, when you read the fine print, there is no requirement that Iran give open access to all its military installations. They have created a mechanism whereby if the UN doubts, right, or suspects Iran of doing illegal activity, right, they have to ask the Iranian government, it has to have a period to respond, etc., okay? So far, no such request has even been formulated, correct? No such request has been made. So we are dealing in hypothetics right now, okay? The argument that the critics make, which I think is the strongest argument that they make, is what happens with the sunset clause. What happens in 10 years' time, okay, when this deal expires, and then Iran might be on the verge of, being able to make a nuclear bomb. That's a different story, okay? That's a different, and I have a different answer to that, frankly, because one can argue in, the way nuclear centrifuges have been developing, okay, whatever the Iranians have right now is going to be totally obsolete in 10 years' time. The same way, they make the centrifuges in generations, generation 1, 2, 3, etc. So even the most up-to-date centrifuges that Iran has, according to IAEA, are obsolete already, let alone what they might be, in 10 years' time. So in short, the response is, what is the better alternative to what we have in order to be able to abandon this and come up with a better one? If the argument is we put more pressures and they cave in, then I have news for you. Ain't happening. Because the Iranians feel that if they were to make more compromises from this point on, right, the US is going to come after them in every other region, every other issue area, human rights and the like. And they think that they have to draw the line somewhere, and that's it.
With that response, I think we have to end our conversation now, and I invite you to enjoy some refreshment and also sign the signing sheet over there, and take some of those brochures if you are interested to learn more about our new program. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Boroujerdi, for an excellent overview.